Hello and welcome to our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is one of India's great icons who has repeatedly and frequently reinvented himself. He was considered the scientific father of the Green Revolution in the 1960s and has continued to represent and epitomize the striving and achievements of Indian agriculture. He's a man of many parts who was recognized by Time magazine as amongst the 3 most eminent Indians out of 20 eminent Asians of the last century, and the other Indians were Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. M.S. Swaminathan. Welcome, sir.
It's a pleasure.
From the time you sort of fathered the Green Revolution in the 60s, and there was this great sort of optimism and celebration, in a sense, of the achievements of Indian agriculture over the decades, we find some of that in some ways diluted and challenged. We've had this, the farmers' suicides. The Prime Minister has called for another Green Revolution. You've been called to chair a National Commission for Farmers. What is the crisis?
Well, since the 60s, when we were what international media described as a ship-to-mouth existence, India, we had to import very large quantities of grains. Well, there was a pressure on all scientists, government, farmers to produce more and change our image. And that happened in the 60s, and what was termed essentially by the media as the Green Revolution was one which changed the whole attitude towards agriculture in our country, one of pride and confidence rather than one of despair and a doom philosophy. Having done that, ours is primarily an agricultural country. Even 2001 census shows 70% of our population live in rural areas. Most of them depend upon agriculture in the broad sense, crops, animals, fisheries, forestry, and agro-processing for their livelihood. Nearly 40% of them have no land or assets also, no land, no livestock, what we call landless labor, who depend on daily wages. And their future depends upon whether there is rainfall. If there is no rain, there is no work in the field. So we have had a large number of second generation problems, both social and ecological. Environmental problems on one hand, overtapping of the groundwater, some parts salinization, water logging and so on. Other places which are drought prone or which are purely semi-arid, unirrigated, rain-fed areas as we call them, or dry farming areas as they are popularly called, their fate is still very much depend upon water.
So in a sense, the crisis is now as much for farmers as it is for farming. It's not really just a question of productivity of food or a shortage of food as it was in the 60s.
It is the problems faced by farmers. A small farm is ideal for intensive agriculture, ecological agriculture. We can produce more. Smaller, the Japanese have shown it, Taiwan has shown it, China has shown it. They are all very small farms, 1 hectare or less. So small farm itself is not a handicap. But a small farmer is a euphemism for a person who has no access to credit, no access to technology, access to irrigation or other kinds of production inputs. Therefore, only by overcoming the problems of the small holders, we can maximize the potential of the small farm.
Is it fair to say that this is an inevitable consequence of globalization, of a new economy, of a new approach to economics where larger economies of scale operate?
Many of our problems are not related to globalization. It is related to our social structure, our enormous population growth. After all, we were hardly 300 million when we became independent. Now it is over 1 billion people, or more than 100 crores of people. 70 crores of people are in the villages. Their livelihoods, the opportunities for non-farm employment, off-farm employment have not grown with the same degree of growth which it was in the farm employment, and therefore we require much more diversification of labor use, a paradigm shift from unskilled to skilled work. After all, if you are unskilled hoeing or weeding, as most of the women do, maximum you can expect is the minimum wage. That also you don't get it in many places. And therefore we must now look harder at these problems, ecological problems, social problems. And there are 4 primary requirements for farmers. Number 1 is credit. If you are a poor farmer, unless I have credit, I can't buy the input. Second is water, irrigation. Somehow there has been a deceleration in the emphasis on irrigation. In the earlier years, there was a large emphasis on irrigation, but now it became more a groundwater exploitation. There is no policy, long-term policy on aquifer management, so that the groundwater is going down and so on. And thirdly, they require markets, assured and remunerative marketing. We see in crops like rice and wheat, where government announces a purchase price, minimum support price, and it's been honoring that minimum support price as a mechanism like the Food Corporation of India to buy it from the farmers.
To what degree is the current crisis a consequence of neglect, of oversight, or of a changing external environment that might have precipitated this? We do have growth rates of over 8%. There was this great sort of platform of India shining. Many people interpret the election results as suggesting, well, India wasn't shining all over India. So to what degree do you think that, how have you arrived at this situation?
The external environment has just started influencing, because if you have a lot of imports from countries which are highly subsidized products, the whole European Union, OECD countries have hardly 10 million farmers in all, 10 million farming families. We have 110 million. They have got 10 million. For 10 million farming families, the subsidy almost $1 billion or 4,600 crores per day is the kind of subsidy. So highly technology, subsidy and capital driven agriculture, and those who have no access to credit, those who are struggling to produce more, this is not comparable. There's no level playing field here. So that our policies, I'm happy the common minimum program of the present government emphasizes the need to insulate farmers from unfair competition. There must be a level playing field, and therefore we are now facing the pinch. If you see horticultural products, increasingly our markets are flooded with important fruits and so on. It's all right. It in some way gives you a standard to improve your own particularly post-harvest technology, processing, marketing and so on. That's important. So we have challenges on the one hand, opportunities on the other, but then it is clear that our agriculture now leads farmers, particularly farming families, and the small farmers, marginal farmers families and landless labor families require support on the production side on the one hand, and the non-farm employment or value addition to time. Unless from unskilled to skilled work they will always remain in what World Bank calls $1 per day, because so long as they're unskilled. So our massive effort in knowledge empowerment, in skill empowerment, shifting a large number of people to non-farm agro-processing, agro-industries, as China had done. When China started revolutionizing its agriculture, they had a two-pronged strategy. One is to help small producers to improve their productivity and profitability. On the other hand, take a large number of people out from the farm. Over 100 million people they took in 7 years out of farm to non-farm employment. We didn't have that integrated strategy of on-farm and non-farm employment, and that is showing up now, particularly with landless poor. So
what are the kind of specific initiatives that you think will help achieve this larger umbrella of ideas that you have been talking about?
The initiative has to vary from place to place in our country, because agriculture is a very variable occupation. There's enormous diversity of cropping systems of land. That is both our strength also. Our strength is we can practically grow any crop, tropical, subtropical, temperate, in some part of the country or the other. We have a great deal of diversity. If you go to northeastern region or the hill region, they have one set of problems, mainly on market and post-harvest processing, transportation, market and so on. Assam has a rice revolution now. They are producing more than they can consume. There is a need for market. Formerly we used to call our agriculture as a gamble in the monsoon, but now it is also becoming a gamble in the market. Both are important, because if I can't sell my product at a remunerative price, then what do I get? This is one kind of problem. The other kind of problem is the diversification of our farming systems. There is emphasis now on horticulture, animal products. For example, if you want to produce 4% growth rate in agriculture, we have to have at least 8% growth rate in horticulture, animal husbandry. Our poultry industry is growing, but poultry requires grains like soybean, maize and so on. So we have to think of a package, location specific packages developed in consultation with farming families. I've always said farmers live, they have wisdom. They may not have a degree like a PhD or a MSc, but they have wisdom which has come from growing day by day, struggling with their problems.
The MS Swaminathan Foundation in Chennai is doing a lot of work on just what you were mentioning, sort of looking at aspects of traditional knowledge, and looking at how new technologies can be brought to the farmers. You're working on bringing the internet and radio to farming communities, and that's in fact what brings you to Delhi on this visit, where we have the privilege of recording this conversation. What are the objectives and the striving of this initiative?
Well, we try to address some of the problems which are crying for attention. We started work on pro-nature because anything we do with natural resources must have a long-term, not only a short-term objective, but a long-term objective. We must enhance the productivity of land, productivity of water, conserve biodiversity. So we said pro-nature. Then we must, the Antyodaya principle of Mahatma Gandhi, I always believed, because that gives you a perspective. If you start from the poorest, then everybody benefits. If you neglect the poor are left behind. So we said it's pro-poor. Thirdly, there is a problem of feminization of agriculture, feminization of poverty. So we said must be pro-woman. And so, but to a job-led economic growth in rural India. That was our objective. We tried to develop models. After all, a non-governmental organization can only show we can do this. The bio-village model, as we call it, in the Union Territory of Pondicherry. Bios means living, means a human-centered development. Very heavy emphasis on non-farm employment, but value-added employment.
Much of this seems philosophically, ideologically, in some ways, at odds with the idea of biotechnology, with the ideas of genetic engineering. In what ways was the initiatives that you took? And there was genetic engineering involved in the Green Revolution, and you led that. So in what ways are you working to protect ourselves from some of the consequences, the feared consequences of these initiatives and ideas?
Well, some of the apprehensions are real, some of them are potential problems, which when you start manipulating genetic material at the molecular level. I mean, genetic manipulation has been there from agriculture in India or many other countries. Minimum is a 10,000-year-old private sector industry. It's the oldest and the largest private sector industry of not only our country, at any other country, because these are all individual farmers. From that time onwards, selection of material, new varieties have been taken. That is why we see enormous variability in nature. But what we now call modern biotechnology, one aspect of it, genetic modification, which you referred to, involves, of course, transfer of genes from totally unrelated species to a cultivated species that may have environmental problems, that may have food safety problems. There are also the other problems like intellectual property rights. Sometimes popularly it is said the Green Revolution was a product of public sector research or public good research. The gene revolution or the modern biotechnology revolution is a private sector research. Will it increase the rich-poor divide? Will the poor have access to modern scientific knowledge? So there are ethical issues, there are equity issues, there are environmental issues, there are food safety issues.
Just elaborate on this. I think it was that when you were doing research in the 60s, the fruits of that research were available to all. They were in the public domain. But now we have Monsanto, we have other multinationals who develop these hybrids who want to use it for commercial exploitation and are possibly less sensitive to the social implications of what they're doing. What kind of sort of solutions do you see to this imbalance?
A commercial company, after all, they are responsible to their shareholders. They will have to make money. There is, you can't really, they are not philanthropic institute. That's all right. But what it really implies is, whether in the case of medicine, HIV, AIDS, or tuberculosis, or malaria, a vaccine, or leprosy vaccine, many of these, it only means if you want to take modern science to the poorest of the poor on the Antyodaya model of technology development and dissemination, there has to be an increased investment in utilizing the latest tools of science for public good benefit. The public good research, there should be no disinvestment or deceleration of investment in the public good research, particularly for those. Otherwise, we will have orphans remaining orphans. The problems of the poor will not be attended to. For example, dry farming areas or pulses or salinity. There are large areas in this country affected by salinity. Who is going to work? That is why in our center we took up such problems of drought tolerance, salinity tolerance. We have transferred genes from mangroves to rice and so on for seawater tolerance. Tomorrow there is a climate change. If there is a sea level rise, how will we? We are a country of over 100 crores of people. We have to also do anticipatory research to face the new problem, not only current problem arising from climate change. So I would say there has to be a balance in any country between private and public sector. The public sector has a particular responsibility to address problems of fragile environments, unfavorable environments, and also how to see the technologies reach the poorest of the poor.
So what would you say, what are the real fears, legitimate fears that sort of, the average consumer of agricultural products, such as you or me, can legitimately experience?
Well, I think legitimately in the coming years you are going to see a great impact of modern science, including what we call the new genetics. The way every aspect, our health industry, the whole bioremediation, supposing arsenic poisoning in water in West Bengal and Bangladesh is a problem, groundwater. It can be removed by microorganisms, what is called bioremediation. You are going to see more and more application of science in day-to-day life.
How can this be regulated and managed so that some of the pitfalls that you mentioned are avoided? There is already a dispute, say, between Europe and the United States on how much or how far bioengineered product should be consumed.
Government has a key role to play. The regulatory mechanisms must inspire public confidence, media confidence. Regulation, education, and social mobilization are the three pillars. Government must regulate. At the same time, people must be educated. We may have a Biodiversity Act. Most people in the villages do not know. We go to Rome and say Codex Alimentarius standards of food safety. How does the person in the field know? So we need a very large, this is why I have been interested in the mobilization of modern information communication technology, particularly the radio, the internet. These are very powerful. The combination between community radio, I think our whole policies must change in order to allow people to have access, small areas, contiguous areas, ecological areas, a community radio combined with internet. You can give the latest information to them. All along the coastal areas, fishermen could be guided and so on. So we need in this country, because if you look at the rich-poor divide from the Industrial Revolution of Europe, you find technology has been a very important factor in enlarging rich-poor divide. Today we must enlist technology as an ally, as a friend, to bridge the divides, gender divide, genetic divide, and economic divide, technological divide. We should make it all the divides must become really no divides at all, but all have benefits from new technology.
What are some of the key areas that you would recommend that technology?
Well, fortunately our country has made both investment and we have tremendous expertise in certain areas. Biotechnology, we have considerable expertise. Information technology, the world acknowledges our leadership, particularly in software development. We also have a considerable expertise in space technology, our space applications. We are going to have an education satellite, totally committed to it. We have tremendous capacity in distance education today. There are distance, apart from the Indira Gandhi National Open University, we have state universities, and nuclear energy and nuclear applications in day-to-day life, isotopes, food irradiation, many other. Now, how do we take all this to the people on a very large scale? What I have been calling lab to land or land to lab, it is not one way, we have to learn from the other way also. This requires much greater attention today. This is where the knowledge age, as we call, or information age as we call it, we must capitalize. That is why I believe that by August 15, 2007, which marks the 60th anniversary of our independence, we must have every village, 600,000 villages of our country, must have the benefit of both the internet, the radio, the cable TV, and of course the vernacular press, all of them, because we have entered a knowledge era. And even agriculture today is becoming more knowledge intensive, not chemical intensive. It is not capital intensive, chemical intensive, but knowledge intensive, ecological agriculture. That is to our advantage where we don't have resources. But then how do you get the right knowledge at the right time, at the right place? And how do you get an interactive one, feedback between farmers and so on? So I have great hope that if we utilize our capacity, utilize the benefits of our investment in science and technology in a really meaningful way, with a social commitment, then we can leapfrog in certain areas. Just as another green revolution you talked about, I call it now an evergreen revolution, because evergreen revolution means improvement of productivity in perpetuity, and not at one shot and go back, but without ecological or social harm. There are great opportunities.
You know, I've had the privilege of talking to you several times over more than a decade, and each time you sort of manifest an infectious enthusiasm and optimism about what is possible and what will happen in a larger sort of climate of despair, where most people tend to be despairing about what will happen, and there's corruption and there are all the obstacles to change and progress. What gives you this sense of feeling of ebullience and possibility? Where does this come from?
There are two major reasons. One is our democracy. Fortunately, we have a democratic systems of governance, and if we really now give meaning and content to the Panchayat Raj, starting from below our democratic structures, we have elected bodies with 1/3 representation of women. It's a very major gain in this country, and unlike our neighbors and many others, we must make full use of that democratic, because democracy means consensus, conversation, dialogue, not coercion, not oppression, but conversation and consensus building. That gives me a lot of confidence, and I find every year our democratic traditions are getting strengthened, not weakened, as the recent elections also showed. It is getting strengthened. The second is technology. Modern technology has enormous opportunities here. Information and communication technology we have got, for example, in our villages what we call an entitlements passbook. Every family has an entitlements passbook which gives them information. If I am a Dalit, what are all the schemes available to me from government? They are disaggregated by gender, by age, and so on. That one step of information empowerment on entitlements has enabled them to access their entitlements. So we must make use of information technology much more effectively for meaningful purpose, not only for entertainment and so on, but for meaningful. So I have a great hope, and I see we have always, not that one should muddle through problems. Today we have a very difficult problem of employment, one of our major problems. We say now today food security in this country cannot be measured in terms of millions of tons as we were using in the 60s. It has to be in million person years of jobs or livelihoods. If I have job, I have income. If I have got income, there is food in the market. Market is full. So we must make a paradigm shift. Whatever is relevant in the 20th century, we must get the best out of our lessons there. But now we must, both opportunities and challenges of the present century and the present decade, we must face them squarely.
But surely this optimism that I talked about and faith in the possible is also an aspect of personal philosophy. You were inspired and greatly moved by Gandhi and Gandhian ideals, and contrary to sort of perhaps a misconceived popular perception that Gandhi was always sort of simple, close to the land, close to the people, not entirely enamored by technology. How have you bridged these two worldviews?
Well, you see, if you go back to Gandhi, not everything what he said 60 years ago may not be the same, because the world has passed by. But the basic diagnosis that Gram Swaraj is the pathway to Purna Swaraj. We will have complete independence only from below, working what now it is called bottom-up approach, building. Don't neglect your villages, the rural people. They are the backbone of this country, the backbone of agriculture. And agriculture is the backbone not only of the livelihood and ecological security system, but the backbone of our national sovereignty. If you are a food-begging country, you can't have an independent foreign policy. Therefore, Gandhi diagnosed some of the ills of our society. He didn't call the brain drain as somebody going to United States or Europe. He said the worst form of brain drain is from the village to the town. As soon as you are educated, you feel that time has come for me to leave the village. But you require agriculture's knowledge intensive. Unless the brain and brawn are combined together, we can't progress. And that is why I feel there are many areas of Gandhian thought which you may not be what he said at the time, because we are fighting the British. Today we have a new paradigm, but I think we should draw the basic fundamentals of including non-violence, a society which is going to be violent. If there is no peace and security, as we see in many African countries, it is not anything to do with production, agricultural production. But if there is no peace and security in the country, how can there be any progress? And therefore I would say, whether the past or the new, I don't worship the past because it's old. We don't worship something because it's new, whether it's technology also, biotechnology. But try to get the best which can advance human security and happiness on a sustainable basis in our country.
Just to touch briefly on this personal impulse, to go back to that, where does this personal impulse of hope and possibility come from? Does it come from God, divinity, faith?
Well, I think it is my own background. You see, I was young when we were having the independence struggle. Nobody thought India can become independent. We became independent through a non-violent mechanism, which the world, Nelson Mandela and others, have admired it in their book. So I have always believed for every problem there's a solution. There is nothing which cannot be achieved, provided you work for it. You have a strategy, you work for it, you achieve it, and above all, you are able to generate the cooperation. Synergy between technology and public policy is exceedingly important. Technology alone cannot do anything. For example, we had high yielding varieties of seeds, but if they cannot be multiplied, if they cannot be taken to the farmer, given the inputs, the seed itself will not do anything at all. So we require a political administration which is progressive, which is responsive to the people's need, and a democratic institution by its very nature must be responsive to the people's needs. This is why my faith comes both from democracy and technology, and both I find are thriving in our country. And if we use them in a synergistic way, both of them together, we can solve seemingly impossible problems.
Well, Dr. Swaminathan, thank you very much. This has been a great privilege and a great honor.
It's always a pleasure talking to you, Rajiv ji. Thank you.